The International Monetary Fund Board has approved the payment of $620.65 million in budgetary support for Rwanda, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo as part of the $1.92 billion financing commitments which the Washington-based institution agreed with 6 East African nations in the past 6 months. The deals have come as a relief for the 6 countries. The others would include Somalia, Burundi, and Kenya, which are saddled with debts, a situation made worse by falling revenue collections, declining forex reserves, and depreciating currencies. The IMF funding, which is pegged on the implementation of key socioeconomic and governance reforms by the institution and the governments, most especially the recipient countries, is aimed at helping them deal with the persistent budget deficits and shore up the flagging foreign exchange reserve positions. This morning, to talk to us more about this, I have Ali Khan Sachu, Africa geoeconomist and macro analyst, is also the CEO of Reach Management. It's nice to have you join us on the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Now, what does this relief mean for the East African nations who are currently heavily indebted?
So it's a seriously meaningful intervention. The IMF has given significant amounts of money. There has been a significant portion available for immediate disbursement, so there is no dilly-dallying around the amounts. And also, the IMF is a key intervener because it has a multiplier effect. It gives comfort to other lenders to participate. So, I estimate when you look at the nominal figure that they're talking about, you can multiply that by 2 or 3 in terms of intervention. Of course, it's been pretty broad. I mean, if you're looking at the countries that you mentioned in your opening, and you also spoke of Somalia, Kenya, and one other. The missing countries, if you look at the region, are evidently Ethiopia and Uganda. But overall, this is meaningful, it's important, and it has come at a critical moment for all these countries who are being faced down by serious debt overhang issues.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned the omission of Ethiopia from the list, because that is my next question. When you look at the benefiting countries that include Rwanda, Tanzania, and the DRC, even Zambia, of course, also got fund relief in recent weeks, though not part of the region. Of course, just part of the region. One country that has not been mentioned in all of these is Ethiopia, as you have mentioned. And of course, we know that it is going through a really tough patch. Now, on December 14, Fitch Ratings downgraded Ethiopia further to junk territory as default looms. So why does this seem or feel as though this particular nation has been sidelined?
So I think, in part, Ethiopia's problem has been very poor messaging and a very poor handling of the issue. They presented bondholders with a fait accompli. There was very little discussion around their proposal. And I think, they're being punished for an inability to really communicate with key stakeholders. And I put the IMF into that category as well. And I think that's what's happening here. As you know, Ethiopia have defaulted. The 2-week grace period for a $33 million coupon payment has expired. And essentially, they're going to have to go cap in hand to their stakeholders in order to push the needle from here. So if I'm really thinking what's happened to Ethiopia, I think it's a story of very poor communication, an inability to corral its main stakeholders and get them to the table and get them to the negotiating table, and a slightly arrogant attitude of basically presenting its main stakeholders with a fait accompli.
Now, with Ethiopia out of the picture, what are the major issues affecting these other countries in terms of the falling revenue collection crisis, the declining forex reserves, and the depreciating currencies that actually characterize these countries?
So you've nailed it. That's precisely the challenges that these countries are facing. It's pretty generic. What one can say is they overborrowed during the good times, when money was easy, and available, particularly in the Eurobond markets. Ethiopia got that Eurobond at that time. Kenya similarly overborrowed, and now basically the party's ended, and we're at a time when bondholders are not so keen to lend. In fact, international bond markets are largely shuttered to sub-Saharan African issuers at the moment. You've got currencies which have been largely in a tailspin because of the challenges around the debt, and therefore really net new money was required. And the IMF, and don't forget the World Bank, have come in and basically putting some kind of safety net below these countries. This is therefore, part of that safety net strategy. I think it's also needs to be analyzed in a geopolitical context. The West was a little bit friendless on the African continent, particularly at the beginning of the Ukraine issue. And I think this is part of the fight back by the West in order to make its presence felt across the continent. We've seen it in different shapes and forms across the continent. Angola, where the president recently visited Washington. West Africa, parts of it have been lost. And I think you're seeing the West now push back and say, look, in the large scheme of things, this is not a huge amount of money. 1.8, $1.9 billion is not a big ticket, but it is vitally important for these countries, and also, as I said, has a multiplier effect.
Okay, let's now quickly look at what the economists are saying as regards Rwanda. It's quite interesting. Now, Rwanda, as we know, it seems not to be doing badly for itself in terms of economic growth in the last few years. Now, the fund noted that Rwanda's economic growth remained robust at 9.2%. And economists say that it should be excluded from the $268.05 million relief that it recently got. Now, in the face of macroeconomic imbalances, droughts, and severe floods that the country is faced with, should Rwanda still have, should it still have been left out, or maybe substituted with Ethiopia that is actually in dire straits? What's your take?
So my take is that, look, Rwanda is being rewarded for better macro policy management. Essentially, it's managed its affairs significantly better than some of its peers. And I think the IMF is seeking to reward that better management with this new facility. It's a tough time for everybody. And I think the IMF is saying, look, Kagame's Rwanda has been an outperformer, and we shouldn't therefore squeeze them because of that outperformance. So that's the way I think the multilateral is looking at the situation. There's significant tailwind behind Rwandan growth. Let's keep that motor running on the road. And I think that's why they've brought this package of support to them at this time.
Let's now throw Kenya into the mix and see how they have also fared in that regards. Now, Kenya is another country with strides when you look at it, of course, with its plans and reforms to turn around its economic challenges. In November, the IMF staff reached an agreement with Kenya for an expanded $938 million of financing. And the funding, which still requires IMF board approval in January anyway, would result in the fund granting Kenya immediate access to around $682 million. Now, looking at Kenya's reforms driven by the Ruto administration, do you think that it will get that much needed support?
Yes, I think the Kenya has been a poster child for the IMF. It's implemented all the reforms that the IMF was looking to see implemented. It's leaning heavily on the IMF and the World Bank at this point in time. It's putting into play all the ideas that the IMF is keen on. We've increased VAT on fuel. We're looking at privatizations. We're seeking to increase the tax versus the GDP, and there is a momentum behind the reform program. And I think, therefore, Kenya is largely seen as a poster child for this new period of IMF support for Africa. On top of that, the big challenge, of course, the big elephant in the room is the $2 billion Eurobond redemption, which is looming large in 2024. So you've got to contextualize some of that IMF support as being support to assist Kenya to redeem that Eurobond in the scenario where the markets remained closed to Kenya, which remains likely at this moment in time. So over and above support, you've got this redemption issue, which the IMF is keen to support Kenya for.
All right, let's now look at the other countries. We'll talk about Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Somalia. Now, these countries are grappling with crippling debts and exacerbated economic woes. So we know their struggling economy. We know how it is trying to survive. We know that it is heavily indebted, though Tanzania is trying to rise above board. But then when you look at the interventions, do you think these interventions will be enough to bolster macroeconomic stability for these countries?
So look, all these countries have a different narrative. It's not one single narrative across all those countries. Somalia is a special case. It's now emerging from a long entrenched issue around its debt. They're threading that needle. We had some recent announcements which are showing that Somalia is making a lot of progress from the situation that it was in. And I think that's important to note in that context. In Tanzania's case, a very robust economy. If you look at it, it is an economy which is poised for substantial growth, I think, over the next decade, hit a little bit of a speed bump, IMF stepping in to sort of grease the wheels a little bit and keep the momentum running. So I see Tanzania as a very positive story, and one like Rwanda, where Rwanda is obviously on a much smaller scale, but where the IMF is saying, you know what, we can give them some more assistance, keep the motor running, keep them going. And I think that's what that story is about. DR Congo is interesting, of course, there's the election going on right now, considerable political instability in the east. But really, the DR Congo economy is key to the next century globally. It might not appear that the economy is punching at its weight, but really it's a critical supplier of critical minerals to the global economy. And I think the IMF, the World Bank, and others are seeking to keep their finger in the pie and not lose DR Congo to China, for example. And that's why you're seeing that element of support. Overall, I would say, yeah, this part of the world is performing better in its current context. It has hit these. We should see a pretty meaningful recovery start to take shape.
Now, looking at all these countries that we've put into context, according to the IMF, most of the end June 2023 quantitative performance criteria and indicative targets were met for these countries, meaning that when you talk about structural reforms and implementation, of course, they have been encouraging in these countries. So what's your assessment of efforts by these countries' governments to carry out reforms that meet agreed criteria, despite the peculiarities and challenges that they are faced with?
Yes, interesting question. I think, look, you tend to find reforms happening in moments of economic adversity. So this is therefore an opportunity for countries to sort of boost their reform programs. And particularly in Kenya, for example, you can see that this administration, under significant pressure and the need to get the support of the IMF and World Bank, have had to embrace a much more aggressive and bold reform program. But of all these countries that we're looking at, I think they are essentially undergoing reform programs, some more slowly than others. Others are embracing it more willingly. But I think overall, the direction of policy-making travel is in the correct direction. Some are further ahead of the curve, others slightly behind. But I think one can safely say, look, progress is being made, but plenty of work has to be done. Our parastatal sectors are too big and underperforming by a very big margin. They need to be restructured. There is a huge balance sheet issue because of that underperformance and the debt that's being carried in that sector. The issue around tax versus GDP. I worry sometimes our GDP is inflated and therefore that percentage rate is not looking good. But the reality is it might be better than it's being reported because the GDP number has been inflated. But overall, I think, look, there are reasons for optimism. Support has come at the right time. It isn't coming too late. But a lot will now depend on domestic policymaking skills to navigate what remains very choppy waters.
So does it mean that despite these financial intervention by the IMF and of course having policies in place and the level of implementation are all the things that are needed? Are there other things that probably we are not looking at or we are not considering that we also may need to focus on? Because when you look at most especially the external factors that affect the economies of these countries, we don't know when it will end. We don't know how far it will go. We don't know whether it will escalate beyond these. And one would need to be sure that these interventions coming from the IMF, including what these governments will be doing, would be enough to help have these countries pay back their debts and have some form of economic stability. So there are other areas that we are not looking at as regards this.
So I think you're correct. You correctly touched on one of the biggest challenges, which is the exogenous situation and the potential for exogenous shocks. We live in a very uncertain world, as we've seen in the last 24 months, which has created huge uncertainty and macroeconomic instability, which has spilled over into Africa. And a lot of that also was compounded by the sharp rise in US interest rates, which put further pressure on our currencies. We've seen some of those exogenous issues begin to abate a little. For example, it is clear that US interest rates have now peaked. Whether they'll stay at these levels for a long time will be something that we can watch unfold, or whether they will come down sharply. If they start coming down, if US interest rates start coming down, the dollar becomes less attractive, and eventually there'll be support for frontier market currencies like ours in this region, and that will significantly assist the current situation. Because bear in mind, what has also compounded the problem was countries who borrowed in dollars and whose currencies then weakened against the dollar got a double whammy. They couldn't access the markets, and their debt, when converted into the local currency, was exploding higher, and that was another issue. So I would say exogenous challenges are one of the key issues that we've got to keep an eye on. I'm hoping that they're beginning to abate a little, but otherwise I think with this support, the multiplier effect that gets applied to it, with better policy making and some consistency, we can navigate over the next 24 months and get through this.
So should that make up for a longer term solution that some economists have clamored for? Because they're saying that having a longer term solution would help, it will actually help these countries to build a robust domestic revenue models and to help them lessen dependence on external financing. In other words, they're saying that having debt relief, restructuring talks, and financial assistance from the international financiers and institutions might not be enough. What about how to develop a revenue scheme that would be sustainable and would help these countries stand on their toes and not having to all the time go to all these external or international institutions from finance every time when they need these funds to fuel their economy?
So your point is well made, and I think all these countries are attempting to improve the tax collection, produce greater transparency and openness around that tax collection, and also increase the rate of tax collection versus the GDP size of their economies, because historically these have been very low numbers. Now, the problem with that strategy is in an environment where these economies are weak, where businesses are under pressure, when you're squeezing everybody for higher tax takes, it puts additional pressure on the economy. So I think that has been one of the challenges that nearly all these countries, and particularly Kenya, where I am at the moment, is struggling with, is the fact that you're imposing more and more taxes to improve your domestic fiscal position at a time when the economy is weak, and therefore business is suffering, and therefore you hit this Laffer curve where you actually don't collect more tax. Look at some of the fuel tax data that's come out of both Nigeria and Kenya. We've seen a massive dive in consumption. So that tells you as well, you've got to tread a little bit carefully as you seek to increase your tax. You need to do it incrementally and work out where the optimal tax collection level is, not just keep increasing the rates of tax. So I think that's a degree of nuance and sophistication that has been lacking at the moment in most of the policy making that I've seen across these countries so far.
Okay, just to wrap things up, Sachu, well, we're looking at $1.92 million intervention from the IMF. Now, 602.65 million have been given in the first tranche. Now, I'm looking at a case scenario whereby these, of course, it will come in tranches anyway, a case scenario whereby this finance comes and these countries exhaust the $1.92 million, but then are not still able to bring to an end the financial woes. What then happens?
That's the $64,000 question. I think what will then happen, of course, is that they're going to go back and have to size up this program. But my impression is that a lot of thought has gone into the size of these programs, and as I described to you, there is this multiplier effect. Once people see the IMF come in, you get other people piling in, getting a bit more comfortable. The IMF can probably also give some kind of guarantees, which would also increase the amount of money available. So I think there is sufficient cash available to upsize some of these programs if need be. The big advantage of the IMF and the World Bank, of course, is that you're not really borrowing at market interest rates. You're borrowing at much, much cheaper interest rates. So that's also helpful because it's also the cost of money that's been squeezing these economies badly. And over time, you're restructuring your balance sheet. You're reducing the interest rates that are being applied to your debts. And I think that's also helpful. So that's two benefits that are happening: lower headline rates and rolling off more expensive money and new money coming in. And when you take that combination, I think it's going to be sufficient. If it isn't, I think more money will be availed, because in the global scheme of things, this is not big potatoes.
Alikan Sachu, Africa geoeconomist and macro analyst, CEO, Rich Management. Thank you so much for your profound contribution on Business Edge. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Now, despite these concerns, the immediate relief provided by the IMF package offers a beacon of hope for the East African nations that are set to be currently struggling to navigate the turbulent global economic landscape. Well, it is believed that it is a positive step towards economic stability, and it will pave the way for further economic recovery and growth in the region. But then a lot will be hinged on how they are able to bring their reforms to bed to convince the IMF to continue to support them in that regard. So we go on a short break on Business Edge. When we return, we'll bring you international business stories. Don't go away.